All right, dear Joana, thanks for joining me again, second time.
Thank you for having me again.
My pleasure. So I'll just explain how this podcast came about, right? So I've been working on, let's say, a new baby next to the book. So thinking about, transformation as always, right? And how can we scale it? How can we make it more impactful? And then I talked with several people in my network, hey, just shoot at these ideas. And then, of course, also you and I, we had a very beautiful conversation. And I felt that conversation, there was so much energy there that I think 5 minutes after we hung up our virtual call, I texted you, hey, let's do a podcast about this topic.
To which I responded, yes, absolutely.
Let's go. So the topic, well, we both have a love for transformation in general, and of course connected also to customer centricity. And the conversation that we were having is, okay, so you have different ways of transforming organizations. Let's say the old school, let's be honest, the current school of transformation is, 3-year roadmap. It's more, not really flexible. It's more of a black box. I don't really know where I'm going. Not a lot of energy with employees. We've done this before. So during our conversation, we talked about, hey, but actually what's the more future-oriented current approach is adaptive transformation. And then you mentioned an HBR article, and then we took it from there. So maybe let's start from your perspective. Why does it even matter to talk about adaptive transformation?
Yeah, so it's a topic that's sort of near and dear to my heart because I've been writing about adaptive thinking for a very long time. But I think the reason why it's so important now is because we're in the midst, of course, of huge amount of change in terms of AI, in terms of customer expectations, in terms of the explosion of channels that customers use. In terms of organizational complexity, I work with a lot of companies that have a lot of organizational complexity, very matrixed organizations, lots of silos, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to work across all of that complexity. So I think taking a more adaptive approach has become more relevant than ever for that reason, and I hear it time and again from my clients.
That's what needed. So can you describe a bit, what is it? How do people perceive it? What does adaptive transformation mean and how is it different?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I think is incredibly important when it comes to, I think there's lots of components to adaptive to what it means to transform adaptively. So, for instance, one of the things that I hear and that I speak to my clients a lot about is there is no cookie cutter model out there, right? The companies that have been successful at transforming have understood and have appreciated that they need to evolve their organizational design, their approach. There is a core that remains stable in terms of purpose, in terms of your North Star, in terms of why your brand exists. But in order to keep up with the change that is happening around that, companies need to really evolve that organizational design. So that's one of the things, or one of the manifestations, if you like. So that openness to the way that we are organized today is not necessarily the way that we need to organize ourselves tomorrow as things evolve, as people pick up new skills, as we embrace new ways of working, right? It's the organization needs to be adaptive towards that. I hear a lot as well, what works today doesn't necessarily work tomorrow. So experimentation is incredibly important. Pilots, for instance, right? So let's pilot something, let's test it out, let's see what works, let's see where it doesn't work, right? Where it doesn't fit how we work as human beings within an organization, for instance. So I think it's incredibly important to understand that, an organization is a collection of people. And so we need to, of course, be able to adapt to how the pace at which people learn, the pace at which people embrace change. And so it's incredibly important to stay adaptive because the external world is changing, but also because internally, as an organization, made up of a collection of human beings, we need to also be adaptive in terms of how we are modifying our behavior, how we're learning new things. So I think that organizations that are adaptive, they are better at sensing change and empowering people within the organization to sense that change, responding. So thinking carefully about how can we make our organization, not one person and not one leader in the organization, but broadly the organization more responsive to that change and empower people to be able to do that. And then on top of that, how do we realign or redesign our organization as priorities shift or as new ways of working are introduced. So it's about sensing, responding, and then kind of rethinking in some ways how we organize in order to be able to do that over time.
I love the term sensing, right? So that's also something I've been thinking about a lot. Do you maybe have some sort of tangible ideas? Okay, what does sensing mean and how can they do that better?
Yeah, absolutely. So data, of course, is incredibly important in that. And I think that is where AI is opening up a world of possibilities. So how do we take data from different parts of the organization, from different customers, quantitative data, qualitative data? How do we mash that up together? How do we put AI on top of that in order to extract more intelligence from it so that we can have more collective intelligence throughout the organization? So that collective intelligence, how we disseminate it, how we make it available to people within the organization is incredibly important in terms of sensing, right? Being able to kind of exercise that muscle that is sensing as an organization. But of course, it's not only about data. Of course, it also requires us to look at the human behaviors within our organization. So, looking at behavioral design. So I'm a huge fan and I read a lot about behavioral design. So looking at how are people working? How can we make it easier for them to actually sense changes, to respond to those changes? Is there a signal we can use, right? So that people can, for instance, manifest when something is difficult for them, right? Or when they need more help, for instance, to do something. There's a wonderful example from a book called Unreasonable Hospitality, written by Will Guidara.
Unreasonable Hospitality?
Unreasonable Hospitality. You have to read it.
Yeah,
and it's a very deliberate title because that is his philosophy, if you like, Unreasonable Hospitality. And that's what he set out to do in his restaurant. So this is an example from a restaurant, but I think it translates to other situations. So one of the things, and it's a small signal, but that made a huge difference that he introduced was the touch the lapel. So you've got a bustling restaurant full of people and servers. And so they introduced this signal, which is if as a waiter or waitress, you are in some sort of distress or you need help, you touch your lapel. And everyone you're working with knows that means you need help. So rather than kind of chasing your manager around a busy restaurant floor, by which time you might or might not be able to get the help and you're in an even worse position than when you started off, they introduced this signal of touching the lapel. So people knew, okay, you need help. And so they had a system in order to be able to sense and respond to that change. So that's one example. But in a big organization, of course, things work differently. So we need other types of signals. We need to sometimes work in tiger teams, right? So you see a lot of organizations that set up task forces to work around a particular problem, right? They change the frequency that team meets. They change they create cross-functional teams that are better at sensing change across different perspectives. So those are all ways in which we see organizations adapt to this need to be able to sense things, to respond to them in ways that are more flexible and in ways that take into consideration more perspectives as well. Using metaphors, for instance, is one I come across a lot in organizations. It's hard sometimes to talk about difficulty, for instance, in adapting in a behavior or changing to something. So sometimes a metaphor can go a really long way to make those conversations easier, right? I used one recently that is super simple. 3 desserts, right? So picture 3 desserts. You've got a brownie, you've got a tiffin, you've got a rocky road. And a brownie, everyone knows what a brownie is. A tiffin has some nuts in it. And a rocky road also has marshmallows on it, right? So it's sort of like 3 levels.
It's a plus, right?
Plus, exactly. And it doesn't matter if it's a dessert, use something else. It doesn't matter. Yeah. But saying, for instance, as a team, I think we made a brownie. We didn't quite make a rocky road today is much easier than say, I didn't quite deliver what I wanted to deliver today, right? So those are all ways that are centered in human behavior that I think make it easier for us, and of course ways of working that make it easier for us to sense the change, but also to do something about it, right? And make it, be able to have a conversation about it so that we also can respond to that change.
Yeah, in a sort of more safe setting, right? A more experimental setting.
Absolutely.
And when we were talking about this conversation, you also mentioned, several years ago, right? One of my loves is, right, already about adaptivity, and you created I'm not sure if it's the label you created, adaptive thinker, already existed, but you did some research on it. Can you elaborate a bit more on that topic?
Absolutely, yes. So I'm sure somebody else has come up with the term adaptive thinking. I'm not sure, actually. Maybe I did. Maybe somebody else did. But I
claim
think
the URL if they didn't.
Exactly. I'm not sure. But I felt it was an important thing to talk about. And it's really, I think about it as kind of the yin and the yang of problem solving, right? You can think very divergently. That means thinking in lots of possibilities, thinking in analogies, adjacencies, brainstorming. Which is fantastic. That's how we get richer ideas. That's how we identify maybe things we hadn't thought about that could be a problem further down the line. So there's huge advantage in going wide, right, and thinking divergently. But also, we can't just sort of like think divergently forever because we wouldn't take any action.
Yeah, exactly.
So at some point, we've got to converge as well. And we have to actually think about what's the actionable thing that we can do here. That's also really important from an adaptation point of view, because it's picking the smallest kind of experiment or manifestation of what you're trying to do in order to test it, pilot it, see if it actually has legs. So divergent, convergent, right? One thinks in possibilities, one sort of narrows down to the actionable thing that you can do. And both are incredibly important. So it's not a question of which one you do, you've got to do both. It's about when you use each one. And so in an organization, one of the things I came across, it's incredibly important for us to think about which, everyone has a default mode, right? From
the two, you mean?
From the two.
Yeah.
I love thinking divergently. Luckily, I can also converge, but I love thinking divergently. And some people are more prone to thinking divergently. Others are really amazing at thinking in sort of convergently.
Yeah.
So we all have a responsibility to train our less developed side and to really be aware of, in this situation, which type of thinking is most helpful. And so at an individual level, for me as an individual, but also as a team, and also in terms of as an organization, right? So is our leadership thinking more divergently or more convergently? I've seen organizations, for instance, who have created pairings of CEOs, one that's maybe more divergent, one that's more convergent, right? So it's I find
the balance in a team, right?
Exactly. So whether it's a balance in leadership, it's a balance in team, or it's a balance in yourself so that you can benefit from those two types of thinking. I think so that is, I think, a very important thing to think about. If you think about tools as well, right? We use a lot of tools in organizations. Many support divergent thinking, many support convergent thinking. So at the time that I was writing that research, I was also trying to help companies that I work with to think about which tools to use in which situation and how to combine tools that actually combine divergent and convergent thinking. And I think about it as a cycle, right? You go through cycles of divergent and convergent thinking simple things that companies can do in order to create a better balance between those two modes of thinking is, for instance, to be deliberate when they schedule a meeting and say, this meeting is for divergent thinking. Or maybe we have reserved 10, 20 minutes for divergent thinking, and then we're going to start converging. So that's one way in which you can start to be more deliberate. An example that I love, and it's an older one, but I think it's fantastic, is from a company called USAA in
insurance,
the US.
Right?
Insurance, yeah, and veterans or families of the military predominantly. And what they did is they did a lot of human-centric training, which is something that I know you're very passionate about. But I think one of the really clever things that they did is they had these 5 core human-centric questions that they trained everyone on. Things like, have we talked to actual people about the solution that we're building? Or what is the riskiest assumption that we are making, right? So have we thought divergently enough to think in terms of risky assumptions? Have we pivoted from feedback that we have received as we're building? So that's kind of like, as we're converging, let's not forget that sometimes we need to diverge again because we've gotten a piece of feedback that we didn't expect. So super clever questions, not rocket science, but very important questions. But the clever thing that they did was they printed these cards with these 5 questions, and they printed them in the shape that people could fold them and put them in their badge holders. And the idea is everyone can ask these questions and should be asking these questions as they're going about their daily, whether you're doing a retrospective, whether you're brainstorming with your team. It was a reminder that everyone has that power to think divergently and convergently, and we should all be thinking in these human-centric ways. So that's and that's why I'm so passionate about it, because I think it's got such a tangible impact on how people think and also how that impacts the work that they do.
Yeah, and for me, while you were sharing this, what popped in my head as well, when we go again towards transformation, for me it's also the balance between designing and executing transformation. Right, and that's also the old school way of doing that is, okay, we design it once, it's a 3-year roadmap, and then we never reassess. Versus adaptive, okay, yes, we have a rough idea where we want to go, but let's say each quarter we listen, collect data, and we move along.
Yeah, absolutely. I did an interview recently with somebody who works in a health insurance company, and he mentioned this word to me, which I think is wonderful and actually captures exactly what you described, which is coddywomple, which is to move.
Can you spell that for the listener?
Oh my goodness, it's CODIWOMPLE, coddywomple. Look it up. But it's basically traveling purposefully towards a slightly vague or unknown destination.
Oh, that's amazing.
And I think that's exactly, I think, what you described. So,
and do you know if that's like a Scottish origin? Do you know the origin of that word?
I don't know the origin of
Google
the word, but we can Google that. And it's that's very aligned, I think, to the way that a lot of the companies that I work with are describing transformation. They describe it as concentric circles. Right? So there isn't a final destination, but there's concentric circles of transformation that build on each other, right? That go deeper, for instance. So maybe we start with, some education around a new term. Then the next concentric circle is we start to use that to address inconsistencies. Then the outer concentric circle is we start to expand that even wider into the ecosystem. Or they talk about waves, or they talk about eras, or they talk about iterations of things that they're doing, iterations of teams, right? So I've seen many companies and customer experience teams, which is the teams that I often speak to, that have gone through various iterations, that have expanded, contracted, they've changed reporting lines, they have taken on new skills, they have embedded other skills into the organization. So I think that is
like a living organism idea, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's almost indeed. Yeah. So and there's articles that compare that type of transformation to an octopus, right? There's lots of analogies out there. An octopus that can shapeshift, can change color, can adapt to its sort of environment. And I think that those are all useful ways of thinking about that. Thinking about transformation because things are changing so rapidly. So you often do need to adapt and maybe change and be willing to also adapt your organizational design accordingly to that.
And for me, it also resonates with one of the podcasts that I recorded with Richard Stark, right, about about embracing your courage, and also really it's connected to vulnerability, to not having the answers, right? We are on this journey, and no, I as a CEO, I cannot have, as I used to, all the answers, because we need to learn along the way. I need to get different perspectives, right? We need to combine different perspectives, different DNAs to figure out this puzzle as we are going along.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and having, I think it's also, so this, we used to think, I think, in more kind of control and command terms. And I think that it's kind of embracing this, this idea that it is this organism, right, that is changing, and we do need some shared context, right? So there are things that remain important, right? What is our purpose? What is our brand mission? What is our brand promise, right? What are the things about our brand that stay core and maybe change less, right, or more structured? But so that's our shared context, right? So that everyone, for instance, journeys. I talk to a lot of companies about the importance of journeys as a way of thinking about our customers' goals, right? And so everyone in the organization having an understanding of what the most important goals are that customers are trying to achieve when they interact with you as an organization is really valuable shared context. Yeah. But within that, people should be able to also operate sort of with some autonomy in order to be able to deliver on what exactly that means. Exactly. Right? Yeah. Whether I'm in finance or I'm in part of a product team or a delivery team. So the shared context is super important. I'm a big believer that journeys is an important part of that shared context. But then we need also that flexibility to sense, to respond, to be able to assemble in different ways to solve different problems as they occur, which requires assembling different stakeholders, right? Cross-functional teams, for instance, you don't have to have sort of the same composition every time. They too should be able to kind of expand and contract, and maybe at one point you do need somebody from legal and compliance to be there and very involved in the design of something, right? But maybe later they become more of a consultative, they take more of a consultative role, right? So that flexibility also in the way that teams work around that shared context and with more democratic access to the insights and the data that they need to make those decisions, I think is how I've seen companies succeed as well. Yeah.
And I think looking at, so transformation, and I think our shared love also for, let's say, the customer centricity side. If you look at, because it's not easy, right? That's why we both love this puzzle. Yeah. So if you look at your experience so far, conversations that you've had, can you sort of maybe list what are the top 3 challenges? And then also how would you go about, if there's a CEO listening, what are sort of some smart solutions for those challenges? What you can say, okay, this is what you can start doing tomorrow to be more adaptive.
Yeah, so I think, there are definitely some key challenges out there. There is, so a lot of, one of the ones I come across a lot, change in leadership, right? Somebody new comes in, they want to make their mark in the organization, which is a very natural and human thing to want to do. And that can sometimes really, we kind of revert back to that kind of command and control, and we're going to do this, and now we're going, now we're in this transformation that's new because there's a new leader. And that can sometimes, disrupt that kind of more organic, adaptive change that's happening within the organization. So that's a big challenge. I think the challenge that you mentioned before, right? As beautiful as the concept is that we're traveling purposefully to this vague and uncertain kind of destination, a lot of people are very uncomfortable with that. It's not a comfortable place to be. It's why, agile ways of working have also, it really requires a change in mindset, right? So I think the change in mindset is one of the biggest challenges. I think there are plot twists, like changes in leadership, that can represent a really big challenge to that more adaptive way of thinking. And the short-term pressure of delivering on results, of course, right? I mostly work with companies that are on a quarterly cycle of delivering on results, right? Yeah. Certain KPIs, certain metrics. And that can also sometimes, get in the way of longer term thinking and thinking in terms of in this more adaptive way in concentric circles, plus the culture change, which is very difficult, right? And we know that for a lot of organizations, they probably don't invest enough in that culture change in order to be able to create that shared context so that everyone is comfortable moving more adaptively. Yeah. So I think those are the biggest challenges. Where I've seen companies overcome those is sometimes there's a visionary leader who actually has maybe the patience to be able to actually hold more space for that more adaptive way of changing. Or there is a burning platform, right? And so there's the need to make
urgency,
the urgency to make that change. But also, I think investing in data, investing in AI, investing in the right context around that, so that the organization, so that the data can start to do more of the legwork as well, to make the organization better at sensing and responding. So companies that have invested in, if you like, the plumbing and the foundations that make an organization more proactive, if you like, and better at sensing and responding to changes in the environment, whether it's external or internal. I think that is where I start to see sort of some really positive changes in how they're transforming.
Yeah, I think that also connects to, I think apart from just designing your plan, I think you have to think about how do we get in the driving seat of steering this transformation. Right? So how do we design the transformation experience, right? What does it look like for employees? But also how do we keep the rhythm going, right? And be more conscious about how do we actually design that, right? What puts us in a driving seat without saying it only has to be hard numbers, right? You also said it's a balance of quantitative and qualitative, right? Collecting stories, collecting examples. But to really consciously design, okay, we have a rough idea where we want to go. We want to be adaptive, but how do we make sure that what do we need, right, to actually learn as we go along?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that so one of the things that I think is incredibly important in supporting that is storytelling, right, which you're alluding to as well. So that's another really rich area of adaptation that I see at the moment. And AI is, again, reinforcing that and making that easier, which is...
You can collect them at scale now, right?
Exactly. But also, how can we adapt how we speak within the organization, right? So, let's say I'm talking about journeys, right, often. But it's different when I'm talking to the CMO versus when I'm talking to the CIO versus when I'm talking to a CEO, right? So the ability to also adapt our language and how we talk about things so that we can connect in the right way with the different stakeholders within our organization, right? So
understanding their context, right?
Exactly, and what they care about and what they're responsible for. So I think it requires us understanding how we can adapt in order to speak the language of the business and whoever it is that we're speaking to within the business, creating that shared context around it so that everyone is hopefully working towards the same vision, even if there's some uncertainty in exactly what it looks like. I think refreshing that, right? I think repetition is really important, right? And sometimes we think, oh, we've said that before, right? And then we stop saying it. But the fact is, new people join the organization, people forget, they have a lot of things that they're sort of, tasked with doing. So repetition, the storytelling, adapting our story in the right way to speak to the right people, I think is incredibly important to keep the momentum going of that more adaptive way of transforming. Of course, measuring the success of it, sharing that success, celebrating those successes, not sort of sweeping failures under the carpet, speaking about those productive failures, right? What did we learn from that? I think it requires one of the big mindset changes is, of course, embracing this more adaptive but also more learning mindset, right? That we are here to learn, we're learning along the way, and then we are adapting, we're sensing and responding as we go along. But it's something that for a lot of organizations is a big shift, right? Because we don't like to talk about failures. Most companies have metrics in place that are very counterproductive to people experimenting and actually learning from productive failures. We should be. I came across one organization and they sort of measured their rate of failure, but not to crack down on it. On the contrary, to make sure that they were being experimental enough, and that a certain percentage of failures is actually a good sign. It's a sign that we're taking some risks, that we are actually experimenting and learning, right? But you have to have those processes in place to also learn from that and to be able to adapt. And it does also require courage, right?
Yeah.
To keep going and to keep that momentum going. So understanding also clearly, one of the things that we often examine is, it's about more than just setting out a vision, right? You need to then also understand how are decisions made in the organization so that we can make sure that the insights are flowing to the right people at the right moment so that they can make those decisions. What is our operating rhythm? Right? Is our cadence right? For a lot of companies that I work with, the cadence they don't have a lack of data, but the actual cadence at which they are collecting or they're sharing that is often out of sync with the work that people are doing. So you've got an agile team that is working in 2 weekly sprints, but the insights they're getting are maybe monthly or quarterly, right? That's out of sync. So we need to think carefully about very practical things like where are decisions made, what's the operating rhythm, so that we can keep that adaptive transformation momentum going as well.
And I think what's also interesting is that because, of course, we're still, let's say, working in the existing system that needs, visible results. And for me, what I've been learning the last 25 years is that the adaptive approach is a easier way to prove in the short term that it actually makes an impact versus the 3-year black box. We have no idea where we're going, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and of course we are measuring the success of that, right? And it's the classic sort of debate around leading and lagging metrics, right? We've got some very lagging metrics, but for an adaptive organization, you need a lot more leading metrics, right? You need small measurements, right? Of are we moving in the right direction? Which I agree with you. It's a huge benefit actually, rather than sort of like we're going to put something out there and then we're going to see in 3 years' time and nobody's doing that, right? They're measuring along the way quarterly, hopefully at least, but still like more leading metrics, like, can we actually put a finger on the pulse and see, like, is this working? And have the courage to pivot if it's not working. That's the other thing that I think gets in the way, coming back to your question about challenges, that I think really gets in the way of companies being more adaptive, is the ability to pivot, right? We've learned something. It's not what we were expecting. But now we're going to pivot and we're going to change from that. Because often, like, once the train's left the station, it's very difficult to actually kind of halt it and change how things are done. Then those leading metrics become incredibly important in order to, and the ability to then say, okay, we're going to like shift slightly because this is not exactly working, and bring the right people together to be able to do that.
Yeah. So you mentioned several challenges. You also already, for, let's say, the person listening well, you also mentioned already some good tips and tricks. But just to help our listeners sort of summarize, if I'm listening and I want to become more adaptive tomorrow, do you have like, I would say 3, but feel free to have 2 or 4 golden tips that I should start if I'm a leader, right? If I'm part of the senior leadership team, what are the 3 things I can start doing tomorrow?
Yeah, so I would start sort of at a personal level, right? So start by thinking, what's that balance, right, that I have between that divergent and convergent thinking? What about my team? What about my organization, right? Sort of one step, our leadership sort of on top of that. So reflection. I know that you're a huge fan of reflection. So let's start with some reflection about where are we at as an organization in terms of that balance between that yin and yang of problem solving, divergent and convergent. Do we need to make some adjustments there? Do we need to make more space for one of those modes because maybe it's a little bit underrepresented? So I'd start there. I'd also look at, I work predominantly with companies who are transforming to become more customer-centric. So I would start as well with thinking about how good are we at sensing how our customer expectations are changing, for instance. What are the most important things that our customers are doing at the moment? How happy are they doing that? And where do we see that there are changes in expectations? Either because behavior is changing, regulation is changing. So what are some of these big things that are kind of changing or that we can pick up, and how are we picking up those signals, right? So when we look at a customer journey, for instance, and a goal, how often, how frequently are we actually checking in with customers to know when their expectations may be changing? Do we have metrics, signals in place that tell us when things are not working? Maybe there's a metric that's plateauing. Well, that could be a sign that something's not quite right, something might have shifted and we may need to change direction. So think about and start with the most important things your customers are doing, because otherwise it just feels too big, right? So start with the top 3 tasks, top 3 goals your customers are doing. How much of a sense do you have, and how are you collecting that data at what frequency to be able to sense and respond more effectively to what's changing? I would also look at, taking those maybe 2 or 3 key things that your customers are doing. How is work at the moment in order to improve, for instance, those 3 key journeys? How is that work happening at the moment? How are we sharing insights? What are the decision-making points? Do we have cross-functional teams that are coming together? Do we have a cross-functional steering committee that is coming together? And what kind of conversations are we having in those and at what frequency in those steering committees in order to be able to become more adaptive in our way of operating? And I think, it's a big question, right? To sort of, solve that for a large, complex organization. So I would say, start with maybe those, the top 3 goals your customers are trying to achieve. Maybe pick one that is at the moment very painful for your customers and that you're trying to adapt, and really look at it through the perspective of how adaptive are we, or how good are we at sensing and responding, and really being able to, across different parts of our organization, drive action to improve that. And that's a good indication or a good test of where you're at. And then maybe pick one that's a little bit more innovative as well, right? So that you can also maybe use that as a test of how good your organization also is in thinking more divergently and adapting to sort of new ideas, more uncertainty. And that's probably a good place to start.
Nice. I think a lot of valuable tips there. It's a sort of, manage ourselves toward the end of the conversation. Just checking anything you feel that we forgot to cover for people listening, wanting to continue on this journey, start on this journey of adaptive transformation.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I would say is, which is also sort of a tip to think in this more adaptive way, is look at, the tools. I think, we talked a little bit about tools, but I think that's an important one as well, to think about what are maybe some key tools or questions, like the USAA example, that we use on a daily basis that help us to be more adaptive. When you've delivered work and you're reflecting, or you're doing a retrospective on the work that you're doing, very deliberately ask that question of what was the balance here between thinking divergently and convergently, and sort of like looking at that adaptive behavior. Get into the habit of doing that, right? I think that some of this is also where we need to get into the habit of using some of these tools more frequently and really inserting them in our daily work. So I think that's sort of one last kind of tip I would recommend thinking about.
Well, in that case, thank you so much again for sharing our shared love, but also your very valuable insights. And Yeah, no, something's telling me that this might not be the last podcast that we recorded, Joana.
I hope not. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me again.
Thank you so much.